Welcome. Take a moment to get comfortable. We will ease into the story gently, just a few quiet breaths first. Let the weight of the day begin to fade. Let your thoughts settle like dust falling through still air. Tonight we visit a place where knowledge once lived, the Library of Alexandria, a story that still echoes even after its voice was lost. The year is 331 BCE. In your mind's eye, see a young conqueror, Alexander the Great, standing on the shores of Egypt, gazing out over the glistening Mediterranean Sea. The sun is bright and warm, the waves gently roll against a sandy strip of land, and a small fishing village named Rakotis lies nearby. Alexander has marched triumphantly through Egypt, and here, on this coastline, he envisions something extraordinary. He envisions a grand city that will bear his name and outshine all others, Alexandria. In this calm retelling, imagine Alexander not as a warrior in battle, but as a dreamer laying out a design in the sand. According to ancient storytellers, he even had a dream that guided him a vision of an island called Pharos, just offshore, perfectly placed for a harbor. Alexander believed that this visitation, perhaps by the poet Homer in the dream, so the tale goes, was a sign. When he traveled to view Pharos, he declared it to be the perfect spot for a city, an island marking a natural harbor which, with a great causeway he planned across the water, would create two safe ports. This city would bear his name and would become a new capital of the ancient world. With his architect Dinocrates, the young emperor paces out the plan of Alexandria, scattering barley meal in the sand to mark the locations of walls and streets. The architects marked out the line of the walls with chalk. When they ran out, they improvised with barley flour from their provisions, sprinkling it to outline the future avenues. Legend says that suddenly flocks of birds descended and devoured the flour, an auspicious sign, interpreted as the land's acceptance of the new city and a promise of its future prosperity. It is a gentle scene to imagine, Alexander and his men laughing in surprise as hundreds of tiny birds take part in the city's founding ceremony, unknowingly consecrating the ground. Alexandria's design is elegant and orderly. The shape of the city is said to resemble a chlamys, a military cloak spreading between the sea and the lake. The main streets are laid out in a grand grid, wide and straight. Two broad avenues over 100 feet wide run east-west and north-south, crossing each other at right angles in the heart of the city. These streets are so spacious that chariots can pass three abreast, and on hot days the colonnades along their sides offer shade to pedestrians strolling beneath. The city contains beautiful public parks and gleaming white buildings. Already you can imagine the gentle bustle that will come. The creak of wooden ships docking in the harbors, sailors unloading amphorae of wine and oil, traders carrying spices, papyrus rolls, and gold. But in this peaceful moment of foundation, all is quiet. Perhaps a seabird cries in the distance, and the only footprints on the sand are those of Alexander and his planners, along with the faint white lines marking where future avenues will run. The location is blessed with natural gifts. Alexandria will be flanked by water on two sides, the Mediterranean Sea to the north and Lake Mareotis to the south. This means cooling breezes in summer. Early visitors will remark how healthy and pleasant the climate is here by the sea. At the beginning of summer, the Nile's inundation fills the lake, preventing marshy vapors and making the air fresh. In the hottest months, steady Etesian winds blow from the north, carrying cooler air across the water. We might picture Alexander closing his eyes for a moment and taking a satisfied breath of that sea air, already picturing the thriving metropolis that will rise in this spot. Though Alexander himself will leave Egypt and never live to see Alexandria completed, his dream is set in motion. After his untimely death, his generals divide his empire, and Ptolemy the Firmson Soter, one of his closest companions, takes Egypt as his kingdom. Ptolemy chooses Alexandria as his capital around 305 BCE, and under his care, the city begins to truly flourish. Envision Ptolemy I as a careful gardener tending a young tree. He strengthens the city's fortifications, erects palaces in the eastern quarter, the Brucheion, or royal quarter, and builds temples to Greek gods and Egyptian gods alike, adorning the city with culture from both traditions. He even constructs a tomb for Alexander, ensuring that the great conqueror's body rests in the city that bears his name. Under Ptolemy's guidance, Alexandria blossoms into more than a strategic port or administrative capital. Ptolemy, unlike many conquerors, has a deep respect for knowledge. As a young man, he had shared in the education given to Alexander by Aristotle himself. Perhaps in Alexandria's evenings, we can imagine Ptolemy conversing with scholars and philosophers, reminiscing about Aristotle's lessons on ethics or botany, and dreaming of making his capital a center of learning to rival, or even surpass, Athens. He desires to create in Alexandria a place where all the knowledge of the world could be gathered. In these early years, as the city's foundations take root, a remarkable idea begins to take shape: to establish in Alexandria a library and museum that would be unlike anything the world has seen, a repository of all knowledge and a home for scholars from everywhere. Ptolemy finds a kindred spirit to help realize this dream: Demetrius of Phaleron, a learned Athenian statesman who has taken refuge in Egypt. Demetrius shares with Ptolemy his vision of a universal library, a collection of books that would encompass the literatures of all peoples. Quietly, with determination, Ptolemy sets this plan in motion. Now time begins to flow like a gentle river. Day by day, stone by stone, Alexandria rises from the sands. By day, workers bustle to build the city's grand avenues, its harbor quays and its shining temples, Greek-style columned temples to Zeus and Apollo, Egyptian sanctuaries to Isis and Serapis, all standing side by side. By night, perhaps Ptolemy and Demetrius sit under lamplight, unrolling a map of the world on a cedar table, pointing to places whose books they would love to acquire: Babylon and Athens, Jerusalem and India. They speak in hushed tones of this library that will be the heart of their city's intellectual life. The notion is enchanting and powerful: knowledge as the greatest treasure of all, something to collect and preserve for the ages. Outside, the waters of the Mediterranean reflect a crescent moon, and a warm breeze rustles the palms. A great idea has been born in the stillness of that Egyptian night: a lighthouse of knowledge to be built on the foundations Alexander laid. The city of Alexandria, still young, becomes a magnet for talented minds. Ptolemy invites poets, philosophers, scientists, and artists to his new capital with promises of patronage and prestige. One by one, great thinkers journey to Alexandria, drawn by the promise of a vibrant intellectual community and the support of a king who truly values learning. Imagine caravans arriving under the desert sun, carrying not just trade goods, but also precious books and instruments. Imagine ships docking at the harbor with scholars from Athens, Asia Minor, or Sicily, stepping onto the quay with wonder in their eyes at the gleaming new city. Under the bright sky of Egypt, Alexandria's foundation is set. It has become a cosmopolitan city, a place where Egyptian priests, Greek scholars, Jewish sages, and travelers from lands even farther away walk the same streets. Hear the murmur of many languages in its markets and porticos. Greek, certainly, the language of the ruling class and education, but also Egyptian being spoken by native families in neighborhoods, Hebrew and Aramaic chanting in the Jewish quarter, for Alexandria will have one of the largest Jewish communities in the ancient world. Latin words exchanged by Roman visitors and other tongues from travelers out of Phoenicia or Nubia or beyond. Yet, despite the diversity, a common spirit begins to unite many of the city's inhabitants: a hunger for knowledge and an excitement about the grand cultural project unfolding in their midst. With Alexandria thriving under Ptolemy I, the stage is set for the next act, the creation of the Great Library and the Mouseion. It will be under Ptolemy's son that this dream fully materializes. But before we move forward, take a moment to absorb the atmosphere. We stand on the sun-bathed shore by Alexandria's harbor. The year is still around 300 BCE. The gentle waves of the Mediterranean lap against the docks. In the distance, on the island of Pharos, construction will soon begin on a giant lighthouse that will one day shine, its light for sailors far out to sea. For now, fishermen cast their nets in the late afternoon glow, and the young city hums with optimism. The library exists only as an idea, but already the air here feels different, charged with the promise that knowledge will find a magnificent home. The birth of the Great Library. Now the scene shifts to the next generation. Ptolemy. I has grown old and eventually passes the torch to his son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus. It is under Ptolemy II, around the middle of the 3rd century BCE, that the dream of the library truly comes to fruition. In the soft imagination of our narrative, let us stroll through the royal quarter of Alexandria, as it might have appeared then. The Bruchian district near the eastern harbor is a marvel of Hellenistic architecture. Grand porticos, lush gardens, lecture halls, and courts where scholars and officials walk in leisurely discussion. At the heart of this quarter, Ptolemy II establishes the Mausion, or museum, a word that means the shrine of the muses. Think of the Mausion as an ancient university or research institute. It is more than a museum in the modern sense. It is a community of scholars. In our mind's eye, we see a stately complex of buildings linked to the royal palace. There are columned walkways where learned men, and perhaps a few women, though history tells us little of them at this early stage, stroll under covered colonnades. The gardens are dotted with statues of the 9 muses, patron goddesses of the arts and sciences, as if watching benevolently over the scholars. Inside the Mausion, one building stands out, the library itself. We might not know its exact ancient floor plan, but let's imagine a spacious hall with high ceilings. Along the walls, wooden racks or shelves, like large pigeonholes, hold rolls of papyrus. Each scroll is carefully wrapped around a wooden rod and tied with a small leather or linen tag identifying its title and author. Ladders or stools are placed here and there so librarians can reach the upper shelves. The scent in the air is of old papyrus, slightly sweet and dusty, and perhaps a hint of incense carried from a nearby temple on a breeze. The light is gentle, filtering in through high windows or from an open courtyard, enough to read by, but soft enough not to strain the eyes. This library is the pride of Alexandria. Ptolemy II spares no expense in filling it. He continues his father's policy and indeed expands it. Agents of the king are dispatched across the known world with generous funds to buy books, that is, scrolls, for the library. Picture these agents browsing through the book markets of Athens, Rhodes, or Antioch, selecting copies of famous works or commissioning scribes to make duplicates if originals aren't for sale. They pack these scrolls carefully into wooden crates and load them onto ships bound for Alexandria. Each incoming ship that docks in Alexandria's harbors is also quietly inspected. Ptolemy's decree requires that any books the ships carry, whether merchandise for trade or cherished personal scrolls belonging to passengers, must be handed over, at least temporarily, to royal scribes for copying. In our peaceful journey, we can visualize a ship's captain reluctantly surrendering a bundle of scrolls to a courteous Alexandrian official on the bustling dock. The scrolls might be treatises on medicine from Phoenicia, or a copy of a play by Euripides from Athens, or even a text in a language the librarian has never seen. They are all treasures. The official assures the captain that the scrolls will be returned shortly, once copies are made. True to the king's policy, the finest scribes of the library set to work immediately. They unroll each scroll carefully on long tables, copying every line in neat Greek script onto fresh papyrus. The copying is done with great care in the cool, shaded scriptoria, writing rooms of the museum. Once a copy is finished, it is the copy that is returned to the ship, while the original is kept for the library's collection if the king so commands. In such a manner, many scrolls come to be stamped with a simple note in the catalog. From the ships, indicating they were acquired through this program of book requisition from harbor vessels. Not only do Ptolemy II and his librarians gather Greek writings, they seek knowledge from all cultures. We can imagine, in this serene recounting, Egyptian priests being invited to contribute their records, myths, and scientific observations. In fact, both Ptolemy I and II encouraged Egyptian scholars to accumulate records of their ancient heritage and render them in Greek for this new repository. An Egyptian priest named Manetho compiled a history of Egypt in Greek, preserving the tales of pharaohs and dynasties stretching back into legend. Likewise, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history of Babylonia that may have found its way to Alexandria. Even distant lands figure into this vision. There are rumors, half legendary but beautiful to consider, that Alexandria's library tried to collect texts from as far away as India and Ethiopia, striving truly to hold all the books of all the peoples of the world. One famous story from this era speaks of how the Hebrew scriptures were brought into the library's fold. Ptolemy II is said to have desired a copy of the sacred books of the Jews for his collection. Alexandria had a large Jewish population, and their holy writings were in Hebrew, a language many Greek scholars could not read. So the king, wishing to include this knowledge and make it accessible to Greek readers, reportedly invited 72 Jewish scholars from Jerusalem to come to Alexandria. We imagine these elders arriving by sea, perhaps a bit travel-weary but honored, greeted with respect and ceremony. They settled in a quiet, comfortable part of the library complex, maybe in a shaded courtyard, echoing with the trickle of a fountain. Day by day, in a careful and reverent manner, they translate the Torah, the first 5 books of Moses, into Greek. This Greek version, known as the Septuagint, meaning 70 after the number of translators, becomes a priceless addition to the library's collection. In our mind scene, we see Greek and Jewish scholars comparing notes, learning from each other as they work through lines of ancient scripture, bridging a cultural and linguistic divide through scholarship. True or not in every detail, the story has a hint of legend to it. It symbolizes the library's inclusive mission, to gather not just Greek knowledge, but the wisdom of the wider world, and to make it available in the Greek tongue, which was the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean. Scholars beyond Alexandria's shores also contribute to its wealth of knowledge. Consider the great inventor Archimedes of Syracuse. Although he lived in Sicily, Archimedes corresponded with the scholars of Alexandria. On one occasion, he sent ahead a treatise he had written complete with new discoveries in mathematics and physics to the librarian of Alexandria for safekeeping and critique. We can imagine a roll of papyrus arriving by ship from Syracuse, addressed to the museum. A librarian carefully breaks the seal and unrolls the letter on a reading desk, eyes widening as he realizes he holds something extraordinary. Perhaps Archimedes' explanation of the principle of buoyancy, or his method for calculating areas under curves. A small circle of scholars gathers around to copy and discuss it, marveling at the genius contained in the letter. By the time Archimedes' work reaches wide circulation, it has already been preserved in Alexandria's archives. In this way, the library acts as a hub in an international network of knowledge, drawing in brilliance from far-flung places and sending out copies of its own wisdom in exchange. Now consider the librarians themselves, the early guardians of this growing treasure trove. One of the first head librarians is Zenodotus of Ephesus. Under his guidance, the collection begins to take on an organized form. Zenodotus is said to have set about standardizing texts, notably compiling and comparing different versions of Homer's epic poems to produce a reliable edition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. We can picture him in a quiet reading room, multiple copies of Homeric scrolls spread across a large wooden table, comparing lines by lamplight. He gently smooths a papyrus with his hand and makes marginal notes, perhaps correcting a scribal error in one version by consulting another, or adding tiny marks to indicate pauses or divisions between sections of the poem. Thanks to Zenodotus, the library's copy of Homer becomes a reference point for accuracy, a cornerstone for literary studies. After Zenodotus, other brilliant scholars take up the librarian's mantle. There is Callimachus of Cyrene, a poet and scholar who, though he may not have been the head librarian, played a critical role in cataloging the collection. Callimachus undertakes the colossal task of creating a comprehensive bibliography of the library's holdings. His work, called the Pinnaces, meaning tables or indexes, is essentially an organized catalog of all authors and their works available in the library, sorted by subject matter. Imagine the diligence required. Callimachus and his assistants sift through the scrolls and group them into genres and disciplines: law, epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, medicine, mathematics, and so on. Then, within each category, the scrolls are arranged by author, perhaps alphabetically, or by chronological order. For each author, Callimachus writes brief biographical notes and lists all their works. In our tranquil imagining, he sits at a desk with stacks of scrolls at his side and fresh papyrus sheets in front of him, diligently writing out these lists. The Pinnaces itself grows into many volumes. It is said to have filled 120 scrolls or more, testament to the vast number of works the library has accumulated even by his time, the mid-3rd century BCE. Through his efforts, a visitor to the library can consult the catalog to find where a particular work is located among the countless cubbies and shelves. The Pinnaces is more than a finding aid. It is itself a scholarly achievement, arguably the world's first great library catalog. In compiling it, Callimachus effectively invents the disciplines of bibliography and library science. Thanks to Callimachus, we sense that the library is becoming self-aware of its own enormity, mapping out the landscape of knowledge it holds so that others can navigate it. The atmosphere in the library during these early years must have been one of intellectual fervor and optimism. Scrolls rustle softly, and low voices discuss poetry or science. One scholar might jest with another that a big book is a big evil, as Callimachus teased, preferring crisp clarity over unwieldy length, while a poet friend retorts with a laugh, championing epic grandeur. Such friendly exchanges only spur better work from each, in good spirit. Under the high ceilings, every footstep echoes lightly as librarians fetch scrolls for scholars who then copy excerpts or take notes on wax-coated wooden tablets. One corner of the library might be devoted to copying studios. There, rows of scribes dip their reed pens into ink made of soot and gum arabic and carefully replicate texts so that multiple copies might be sent to other libraries or to wealthy patrons, or simply to have duplicates in case an original wears out. The only sounds here in midday are the scratching of pen on papyrus and the occasional gentle sigh or stretching of a scribe's back after hours of focused work. Outside in a peristyle courtyard, a philosopher may be lecturing to a handful of attentive students under the shade of a plane tree, quoting lines from a scroll in his hand, a scroll fetched moments ago from the library's treasury of books. Meanwhile, Ptolemy II himself walks through the museum's corridors, delighted to see his father's vision blooming. Perhaps he joins the scholars for a moment during one of their communal meals. Strabo, a geographer writing centuries later, noted that scholars of the museum dined together in a great hall, sharing meals and ideas under the royal patronage. Let's imagine one of those convivial dinners, a long table laden with simple, wholesome foods, bowls of lentil stew, bread and olive oil, fresh fish from the harbor, sweet dates and pomegranates for dessert. Around the table, recline and sit the scholars in animated conversation. Over here, a geometer excitedly describes a new property of cones. Over there, a doctor speaks of herbal remedies for fever. Eratosthenes, young and curious, might be asking the elder philosophers pointed questions about the size of the earth or the distance to the sun. The room hums with the gentle energy of companionship and intellect combined. Step outside that hall with us now and take a slow twilight walk through the royal quarters gardens. The evening breeze carries the fragrance of jasmine and lotus blossoms from ornamental pools. The pathways are lit by bronze oil lamps on elegant stands, casting a golden glow on marble statues of poets and scientists of old. Not far off, you might catch a glimpse of the city's bustling life beyond the palace walls, torches of merchants finishing the day's business in the market, or distant music from a festival boat on the harbor. But here in the enclave of the library and museum, a peaceful quiet prevails. A few scholars still stroll with scrolls in hand under colonnades, too absorbed in reading or gentle debate to retire for the night. Perhaps within the library's main hall, Zenodotus, or one of his assistants, is finishing the shelving of a batch of newly copied scrolls, tucking them safely into their assigned niches. They handle each carefully, knowing these fragile rolls carry the thoughts of geniuses long past and far away. The librarians took great care to preserve the scrolls. They kept them in dry rooms, safe from damp sea air, and if a roll showed signs of wear, they would commission a fresh copy so the words might endure. The making of papyrus itself is an art practiced here. Strips cut from the papyrus reed, pressed crosswise in layers, dried and polished to a smooth writing surface. In this climate, papyrus holds up well, yet the librarians remain vigilant against mold or insects, mindful that these rolled writings are truly irreplaceable treasures. By now, the Library of Alexandria holds tens of thousands of works. Some later writers would claim hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The exact number is lost to history and likely exaggerated, but clearly it was by far the largest collection of books in the ancient world at that time. Its shelves contain the epic poems of Homer in their finest editions, as standardized by the library's scholars. They hold the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and the comedies of Aristophanes and Menander. They preserve the philosophical dialogues of Plato and the treatises of Aristotle on logic, ethics, politics, and natural science. On other shelves are the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the medical texts of the Hippocratic school, mathematical works from the Pythagoreans, and from Euclid, the great geometer who had taught in Alexandria around 300 BCE. Every field of knowledge known to the Hellenistic world, geometry, astronomy, poetry, drama, rhetoric, biology, engineering, medicine, finds a place on these shelves. And if a particular work is not yet there, efforts are likely underway to obtain it. Try to absorb the serenity of this accomplishment. Here, perhaps for the first time in history, exists a truly universal library, a place attempting to gather the intellectual achievements of many peoples and all subjects. It's a haven against the forgetfulness of time. Each scroll is a voice speaking out of the past, and the library preserves those voices, catalogs them, and shares them with those who seek knowledge. It is as if the library is a great chorus of human wisdom, murmuring softly through its corridors. Ptolemy II, seeing this success, undertakes another grand project that will become world famous: the construction of the Pharos of Alexandria, the great lighthouse on the island of Pharos just off the city's coast. When completed, this lighthouse stands perhaps 100 meters tall, one of the tallest man-made structures of the ancient world. By day, its white stone gleams. By night, its fire top casts a guiding beam visible for many miles. Symbolically, one might think of the library as the twin of the Pharos. One casts light to guide ships through physical darkness, while the other illuminates the darkness of the mind. Both are beacons that make Alexandria shine brightly in the imagination of those far beyond its shores. For years and decades, the Great Library and the museum prosper. Scholars come and go, but many spend most of their lives here, producing original works as well as preserving and commenting on older ones. Let us recall a few figures whose presence graced these halls. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, who would later become chief librarian in the mid-3rd century BCE, famously calculated the circumference of the earth with astonishing accuracy. Imagine Eratosthenes pacing the library's courtyard on a bright summer day, devising his clever experiment after reading reports of a deep well in Siene, far to the south at Aswan, where, on the solstice noon, the sun shone straight down with no shadow. With patient dedication, he measures the shadow cast by a column in Alexandria at the very same moment and finds it to be about 7 degrees. By comparing this angle to the distance between Alexandria and Siene, Eratosthenes concludes that the Earth is a sphere about 250,000 stadia, around roughly 40,000 kilometers in modern units, remarkably close to the true value. How many late evenings must he have sat by an oil lamp, scrolls of geometry unfurled around him, verifying calculations in the quiet hush of the library's mathematics chamber? Then there is Apollonius of Rhodes, a poet and scholar who at one point served as head librarian. He composed the epic Argonautica, the tale of Jason and the Argonauts. Likely, he refined his verses within these very halls. One can imagine him reciting a newly drafted passage to colleagues in a mellow voice as they sit among the columns at dusk. They offer gentle nods or murmured suggestions. In this culture of creativity, art and science flourish side by side. Poets and astronomers, playwrights and physicians all feel part of the same grand endeavor of understanding and expression. Aristophanes of Byzantium succeeds Eratosthenes as head librarian and brings innovations of his own. It is said that Aristophanes introduced a system of critical marks and accents in Greek writing to aid pronunciation and clarity. He may have been the first to systematically divide poems into separate lines and to mark texts with symbols indicating pauses or emphasis, a step toward the punctuation and formatting that readers today take for granted. We can picture Aristophanes spending long hours with Homeric and lyric verses, adding subtle breathing marks above the lines, testing out with his own voice how these guides improved the reading of the text. Through such innovations, the library made knowledge more accessible and user-friendly, not just abundant. And let us not forget Aristarchus of Samothrace, one of the greatest literary scholars of antiquity, who became head librarian around 150 BCE. Aristarchus was renowned for his deep analysis of Homer and other poets. It was here in Alexandria that he compiled definitive editions of the Iliad and Odyssey, comparing numerous manuscripts from different places and eliminating errors that had crept in over centuries of hand copying. Envision Aristarchus at a large cedar table with perhaps dozens of different Homeric scrolls laid out, some acquired from as far away as Athens or Pergamum. With a patient and discerning eye, he decides between variant readings of a line, writes meticulous commentaries in the margins on obscure words or mythological references, and produces a clear, annotated version of the epics that will become the standard for future generations. Aristarchus' temperament is calm and methodical. He approaches the text with both reverence and precision, much as we are approaching this history slowly and carefully. Under his leadership, the library's reputation for rigorous scholarship only grows further. All these figures, Zenodotus, Callimachus, Eratosthenes, Apollonius, Aristophanes, Aristarchus, and numerous others, contribute to an atmosphere of golden tranquility and intellectual richness. In our relaxed exploration, we see the Great Library at its height, bathed in soft Egyptian sunlight by day and gentle lamplight by night, ever active but never frenetic. It is a sanctuary, a temple of knowledge. Students and seasoned thinkers alike wander its porticos and garden paths, engage in friendly debates under the plane trees, or sit quietly in alcoves reading, their minds traveling to distant lands and eras through the words on the papyrus before them. When you think of Alexandria in this golden era, hold the image of a learned city by the sea. The harbor is busy with commerce, yes, but among the crates of grain and amphorae of wine being unloaded, there are always bundles of books arriving too, drawn to this magnetic center of learning. The Ptolemaic kings. Ptolemy II, Ptolemy III, and their successors continue to support and enlarge the library. There's an oft-repeated anecdote that illustrates their dedication. King Ptolemy III. Euergetes once learned that the city of Athens possessed original state copy manuscripts of their great tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides' texts of incomparable value. He dearly wished to add these to Alexandria's library, so he negotiated to borrow the official scrolls, offering Athens a huge sum of silver as a deposit. Athens agreed, and Ptolemy III obtained these precious originals. He then had his scribes make exact copies on the finest papyrus. But when the copies were complete, Ptolemy chose not to return the originals. Instead, he forfeited the hefty deposit and kept the prized originals in Alexandria, sending Athens back the copies. Whether one views this as cultural devotion or royal audacity, or both, the story emphasizes how far the Ptolemies were willing to go to enrich their library's collection. They valued books as dearly as gold. Indeed, to them, the books were worth more than gold. Under Ptolemy III, another development broadens the reach of knowledge. A second library, often called the daughter library, is established at the Serapeum, a magnificent temple complex in another part of the city. The Serapeum is dedicated to Serapis, a Greco-Egyptian god meant to unify Greek and Egyptian faiths. Ptolemy III either builds this temple anew or greatly expands it, and within its grand colonnades and courtyards, a library is set up, possibly to house overflow from the Great Library or to serve scholars outside the palace circle. We'll return to the Serapeum later in our story, for it has its own dramatic fate. But for now, imagine it as a serene adjunct to the main library. Perhaps it contains duplicate copies of important works, or more practical texts and manuals available to visiting scholars and literate citizens. One might climb a broad stone stair lined with Sphinx statues to enter the Serapeums, library halls greeted by the towering statue of Serapis and the hush of yet more scrolls. By around 240,200 BCE, Alexandria stands at an unprecedented peak of intellectual achievement. It is truly a lighthouse of learning in the ancient world. Travelers from other cities come just to see the library, to consult a rare text, or to seek patronage for their own writings. The library's fame spreads across kingdoms. One might hear in distant Rome or in the courts of Eastern kings a suggestion, half envious, half awed. If you desire true knowledge, you must go to Alexandria. In this idyllic period, let your mind wander through an imagined day at the library. It is morning. The sun has just risen, sending golden beams through a high window and illuminating motes of dust above a desk piled with scrolls. In one corner, a young scholar from Syria carefully unwraps a scroll of Aristotle's Metaphysics for the first time, heart quietly pounding with excitement to read the master's words firsthand. Across the garden courtyard, an older mathematician crouches and draws shapes in the sand for two eager students, illustrating a geometric theorem with a simple diagram. At midday, a bell chimes softly, or perhaps a water clock simply overflows to signal the common meal. Scholars gradually drift from their studies to gather in the dining hall, their discussions hardly skipping a beat as they ladle soup and break bread. In the afternoon, an astronomer stands on a flat rooftop observatory of the museum, adjusting an armillary sphere and mapping the positions of the stars, while directly below in a lecture room, a music theorist plucks the strings of a lyre to demonstrate harmonious intervals, scribbling notes on a wax tablet. Everywhere you look, knowledge is being explored, shared, debated, and cherished. Copies of poems are being made in the scriptorium to send as gifts to a king in Syria. In another chamber, engineering students examine a device that pumps water using a screw, one of Archimedes' inventions. A visiting dignitary from a far-off kingdom tours the library in awe, guided by a proud librarian who shows off a prized original of Euripides' Medea on papyrus, perhaps even letting the guest hold it for a moment so he can feel its texture and appreciate its rarity. Every moment in this library is gentle and purposeful. As dusk falls, the scholars light their oil lamps and continue their reading or writing in quiet focus. Through an open portico, one can see the sky transition to night, now dotted with countless stars. In the distance, on Pharos Island, the lighthouse kindles its great fire for the evening, its glow blinking in the dark as a comforting eye. The lively hum of Alexandria's day quiets to a hush, but within the library a few determined souls still work on, accompanied by the faint sound of the sea and the flicker of lamplight dancing on the walls. Such was the birth and flowering of the Great Library of Alexandria, born from a visionary idea, nurtured by enlightened rulers, built up day by devoted hands and keen minds. It stands, at least in our story at this moment, as the crown jewel of a prosperous, enlightened city. However, as with all things, change is on the horizon. In the chapters to come, we will witness how this haven of knowledge faces challenges from both within its city and from without, challenges that will slowly, inexorably lead to its decline. But let us not rush ahead. Let us linger a while in this golden light, holding onto the image of Alexandria's library in its glory. A quiet, radiant temple of learning standing gracefully on the African shore, filled with the collective wisdom of the known world. Winds of change, challenges of the late Ptolemies. For many decades, the Great Library of Alexandria basked in the sunshine of royal support and scholarly dedication. But history, like the tides, is ever-changing. Gradually, subtle winds of change began to blow through Alexandria, bringing new challenges. Let us gently explore these changes, keeping our tone calm and reflective, as if observing clouds slowly gathering on a distant horizon. By the 2nd century BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty itself was facing internal strife and waning power. The later Ptolemaic kings were not all as stable or enlightened as their predecessors. Court intrigues and family quarrels often spilled into the governance of the city. At times, even the scholarly sanctum of the library could not remain completely untouched by the city's turmoil. One significant shadow fell during the reign of Ptolemy VIII, Euergetes II, often nicknamed Physcon, which means potbelly, reflecting unflatteringly on his appearance and reputation. Ptolemy VIII came to power around 145 BCE after bitter conflict with his siblings. He could be cruel and suspicious, and in our gentle narrative we can sense the atmosphere of the museum growing tense under his rule. This once generous patron of scholars grew wary of those same intellectuals. According to later accounts, Ptolemy VIII may have viewed the scholars as politically unreliable, some of them possibly having been favored by his rivals in the royal family or simply suspect in his eyes for their associations. In response, he took drastic measures. He expelled a number of scholars from Alexandria. It is as if a cold wind sweeps through the library's halls, unsettling its tranquility. Among those said to have left was Aristarchus of Samothrace, the very scholar who had devoted years to refining the text of Homer. Aristarchus, one account tells us, resigned his post as head librarian and fled Alexandria, in haste finding sanctuary on the island of Cyprus, where he would die far from the splendid halls he once supervised. With him, numerous other learned individuals also departed. It's said that Aristarchus' contemporaries, such as Dionysius Thrax, a grammarian who wrote the first book on Greek grammar, and Apollodorus of Athens, a noted scholar and chronicler, likewise left Alexandria around this time, continuing their teaching and writing in cities like Rhodes and Pergamum. We can imagine those exiled scholars in later years reminiscing about Alexandria from afar, their hearts aching like those of lovers separated from a beloved home. Perhaps in Rhodes, an aging scholar looks out at the Aegean sunset and remembers the gentle rustle of papyrus and the convivial debates in the museum's dining hall. A subtle sadness enters the air of our story. Here the realization that even the brightest candles of culture can flicker when political winds blow harshly. Still, the library and museum persisted. After Ptolemy Aphan's purge, subsequent monarchs of the dynasty, like the later Cleopatras, made efforts to restore what was lost. Some scholars returned. New ones rose to prominence. The library regained some of its vitality, though perhaps the utopian glow of its early decades was dimmed. The late 2nd and early 1st century BCE saw Alexandria still as a center of learning, but the world around it was changing in big ways. Rome was rising in the west, extending its reach across the Mediterranean. Alexandria's fate would increasingly intertwine with the ambitions of Roman generals and statesmen. Now we drift forward to the first half of the 1st century BCE, and to a figure who would leave a legendary mark on Alexandria's story, Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic line. Cleopatra was born around 69 BCE, a princess educated in the library's shadow. Cleopatra was no mere figurehead. She was intellectually curious and well-educated. She spoke multiple languages fluently. Reports say at least 7 or 9, including Egyptian, the native tongue her Greek ancestors had never bothered to learn. Some later sources even claim she composed treatises on pharmacology and cosmetics, evidence of a scientific mind at work. We often remember Cleopatra for her political acumen and romances with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But in this calm narrative, we focus on her love of learning. Picture the young Cleopatra as a girl or teenager walking through the library's aisles alongside her tutors. The sunlight of an Egyptian morning filters in as she peruses a papyrus of Greek philosophy or Egyptian history. Perhaps she runs her fingers along the shelves of scrolls, already fluent enough in multiple languages to appreciate texts in each. She likely studied mathematics, rhetoric, and astronomy under the library scholars. By the time she became queen, Cleopatra could converse with learned visitors on equal footing. Her reputation as a cultivated ruler was well earned. However, Cleopatra's rise to power came during a time of turmoil for Alexandria. Upon the death of her father, Ptolemy the Fauve, she and her young brother, Ptolemy the Thorned, were co-rulers, but quickly they fell into a civil war for sole control. Enter Julius Caesar, the Roman general and statesman. In 48 BCE, amid Caesar's own civil war against Pompey, he arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival. The city suddenly became a stage for a dangerous game of politics and war. We now find ourselves in the thick of the Alexandrian War of 48 BCE. Cleopatra, ousted by her brother, sought Caesar's support to regain her throne. In a famously cunning move, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, legend says, rolled up inside a carpet to plead her case. Caesar, captivated by her wit and charm, agreed to side with Cleopatra against her brother Ptolemy the Thorned. Fighting soon erupted in Alexandria between Caesar's forces, along with Cleopatra's supporters, and the army of Ptolemy the Thorned. Let us observe calmly from a distance one of the most dramatic and fateful episodes for the library, the burning of Alexandria's harbor in 48 BCE. Caesar, finding himself outnumbered and briefly besieged in the palace district near the library, resorted to a desperate tactic. To deny Ptolemy's forces the use of the Egyptian fleet, Caesar ordered the ships in the harbor to be set ablaze. One evening, orange flames leap up from the docks. The fire spread swiftly beyond what Caesar intended or expected. We might imagine standing on the library's rooftop colonnade that night, looking out across the city. An eerie glow illuminates the sky, and pillars of black smoke twist upward, obscuring the stars. The harbor's waters flicker with the reflection of burning ships. A hot wind carries embers and the faint smell of charred wood and papyrus. The fire does not consume the city, but it does ravage the dock area and the warehouses near the sea. Ancient accounts differ on the details, but later writers like the historian Seneca would lament that some 40,000 scrolls were lost in this blaze. It seems that among the buildings set alight were storehouses containing books perhaps part of the library's collection, waiting to be cataloged, or copies intended for export, or a secondary depot associated with the museum. In our mindful reconstruction, we can picture a cluster of low warehouses by the water, used to hold excess scrolls or supplies of papyrus. Tongues of flame engulf these structures. Stacks of scrolls, perhaps newly arrived shipments from Athens or pergament copies being prepared, are caught in the inferno. The papyrus curls and smolders. Smoke fills the air with a bitter perfume of ink and reeds turning to ash. By dawn, the fires die down. The immediate crisis passes, Caesar eventually gains the upper hand, and Ptolemy V drowns in the Nile while trying to flee the city. But along the harbor, a scene of quiet devastation greets the morning light. We can almost walk through the soot-streaked ruins of a warehouse where charred scroll ends poke out from piles of black ash. Perhaps a few citizens or librarians venture out, stepping carefully among collapsed timbers, hoping to salvage anything unburnt. They find little. A few half-burned scrolls, the script on them now only partially legible, flutter in the breeze. A sense of grief hangs in the air. The greatest repository of the Tory. Knowledge the world had seen has suffered a wound. Later, historical accounts claim that this fire burned a vast number of books, some say as many as 40,000 scrolls, though the exact truth is lost in the smoke of that night. Did the blaze reach the main library building in the palace quarter? Many scholars think not the main library may have remained intact, since Caesar's fire was largely on the waterfront. More likely, what burned were storehouses containing a large reserve of books, possibly including many duplicates or acquired texts that hadn't yet been shelved. Still, even that is a terrible loss. Yet the library was not completely destroyed. The following years saw Alexandria recover under Cleopatra's rule, with Roman backing. Within a decade or two, geographer Strabo visited Alexandria around 20 BCE and reported that the museum and its community of scholars were still active. One exceptionally prolific scholar, Didymus, nicknamed Calcenterus, meaning bronze guts for his seemingly endless capacity for writing, was working in Alexandria during that period and reputedly wrote over 3,000 books. Such scholarly output would have been impossible without access to a rich collection of texts. These facts indicate that the library, or at least a significant portion of it, survived Caesar's fire, either because the fire hadn't destroyed the main library, or because whatever losses occurred were soon mitigated. Indeed, there's an often repeated story that a few years later, around 41 BCE, Mark Antony, now Cleopatra's lover and ally, sought to compensate Alexandria for its loss by gifting the entire library of Pergamum, the second largest library in the world at that time, with perhaps 200,000 scrolls, to Cleopatra. Whether this transfer actually happened or was rumored by Antony's political enemies in Rome, who accused him of giving away treasures for Cleopatra's sake, it shows that the idea of replenishing Alexandria's library was alive. Cleopatra's rule, 51-30 BCE, breathed new life into Alexandria's cultural scene. We can envision Cleopatra alongside Julius Caesar during his visit, or later Mark Antony, strolling through the library's halls, proudly showing off her city's intellectual riches. Cleopatra herself likely sponsored scholars and commissioned new works. She was known to converse with learned men of her day, and perhaps learned women, though history records none by name during her time. Under her reign, whatever damage the library had sustained might have been tended to. New copies procured from other cities to replace lost texts, scribes working overtime to duplicate works from one medium to another. One later account claims that Cleopatra acquired from Mark Antony the 200,000 scroll collection of Pergamum as a gift. If true, those pergamene parchments would have filled any gaps left on Alexandria's shelves. All too soon, however, Cleopatra's era of relative peace and restoration gave way to more conflict. The Roman civil wars caught up, with her. In 31 BCE, at the Battle of Actium, Cleopatra and Mark Antony's forces were defeated by Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. The following year, Octavian's armies invaded Egypt. Facing inevitable defeat, Cleopatra and Antony each took their own lives in August of 30 BCE. With Cleopatra's death, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire. We might expect that a conqueror would exact harsh punishment on Alexandria for resisting. Indeed, Octavian, Augustus, did plunder Egypt's wealth to pay off his veterans and finance his rule. But to Alexandria's fortune, he recognized the value of the city. He spared Alexandria from destruction. The new Roman ruler even visited the tomb of Alexander the Great in the city, reportedly paying respects, and accidentally breaking Alexander's mummy's nose while trying to touch it, then apologizing. Augustus left the structures of Alexandria largely intact. The library and Mouseion were not demolished. Instead, they were incorporated into the new imperial system. The museum continued to receive patronage, now from the Roman emperors instead of the Ptolemies. A priest appointed by the emperor oversaw the museum, a role that originally the Ptolemies had filled. Alexandria remained a center of scholarship, though it was now one among many in the Roman world, its unique royal sponsorship somewhat diminished. So, as we enter the Roman era, Alexandria's Great Library still stands, though it has endured much. It's worth taking a restful moment to consider. By the end of the 1st century BCE, the library had been through internal purge and external fire, yet it survived. The idea of collecting knowledge had proved resilient. Under Roman rule, the library would continue, albeit without the same lavish support it once enjoyed. The chapter of independent royal patronage closed, but a new chapter under the Pax Romana began. Before we proceed, let's picture the library around, say, 20 BCE under Roman watch. A Roman prefect governs Egypt from Alexandria now, and legionaries guard the gates, but inside the library's halls, Greek scholarly life goes on much as before. A philosopher recites Aristotle's Ethics to a gathering of students in the museum's lecture hall. In the library, a librarian is cataloging some recently arrived scrolls, perhaps a gift from a Roman aristocrat. The torches and lamps are lit as evening falls, and the scholars begin debating Homer's verses or Euclid's postulates just as they did in Ptolemaic times. The political masters have changed, but knowledge remains beyond their reach, in a way a quiet constant amid the shifts of power. Under Rome, the library's fading glory. Now, Alexandria finds itself part of the Roman Empire, an empire vast and powerful, stretching from Spain to Syria. In this new era, the Library of Alexandria continues to exist and serve as a center of study, but its circumstances slowly change. The story of the library under Roman rule is one of endurance amid gradual decline, punctuated by moments of brilliance and, later, moments of peril. Let us walk through these centuries calmly, noting the subtle shifts in the wind. In the early Roman period, 1st century BCE and 1st century CE, Alexandria remains a vibrant metropolis. It's often said to be the second city of the empire, after Rome itself, in terms of population and cultural importance. The emperors know how critical Alexandria is, primarily because Egypt is Rome's breadbasket, supplying grain to feed the empire. Thus, Alexandria enjoys a certain protection and ongoing investment. The museum and library, though now under Roman oversight, still function. Strabo's account around 20 BCE mentioned the museum's community of scholars dining together. This suggests that Augustus allowed the institution to continue with its stipends and staff. Indeed, certain Roman emperors took a personal interest in Alexandria's intellectual life. The Emperor Claudius, who ruled 41-54 CE, for instance, was a scholar at heart. He wrote histories and even devised new letters for the Latin alphabet. Claudius reportedly contributed to the museum. He may have added to the library's collection or supported new buildings. We can picture, in those mid-1st century days, imperial favor shining on the library once again. A shipment of books arrives from Rome itself, perhaps copies of Latin literature that had not been present before. The library by now is not just Greek. some works of Roman literature in Latin might line a special section of shelves to educate Alexandrian scholars on this rising culture's output. You could find, say, the poetry of Virgil or the orations of Cicero among the Greek texts, with a bilingual librarian available to help Greek readers understand the Latin. During the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, Alexandria still produces notable scholars. The astronomer Claudius Ptolemy, not a king but sharing their name, worked in Alexandria around 100–170 CE. Ptolemy authored the Almagest, an astronomical treatise that became the authoritative text on the geocentric cosmos for over 1,000 years. He also wrote the Geographia, an ambitious attempt to map the known world with a coordinate system of longitude and latitude. It's tantalizing to imagine Ptolemy sitting in the library consulting earlier observations recorded by Babylonian stargazers, or the notes of Hipparchus of Rhodes, a 2nd century BCE astronomer whose works Ptolemy had access to. By lamp glow, he compiles star catalogs and planetary tables, relying on the library's resources to build a synthesis of astronomical knowledge. Perhaps Ptolemy even had access to an old scroll by Aristarchus of Samos, the 3rd century BCE thinker who proposed the radical idea that the Earth orbits the Sun. If so, he might have held it in his hands, considered its heliocentric argument, and set it aside in favor of the geocentric model that observation and philosophy of the time favored. In any event, Ptolemy's works themselves joined the library's collection. Ironically, they would later be some of the only remnants of Alexandrian science that medieval Europe knew in detail, preserved through Arabic translations long after the library was gone. Another prominent figure is Galen, the Greco-Roman physician of the 2nd century. Though Galen spent most of his career in Rome, he studied in Alexandria's medical school for a time. Alexandria, since the early Ptolemaic era, had been a center for medicine. The library would have held treatises by Herophilus and Erasistratus, the pioneers of anatomy who had lived in Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, performing dissections and advancing medical knowledge. Galen came to Alexandria around the 150 CE to learn anatomy, since it was one of the few places where the dissection of human bodies, or at least of animals, was part of teaching. We can imagine Galen in a marble anatomical theater, watching a demonstrator carefully open the body of a monkey or pig, identifying organs described in centuries-old Alexandrian texts. After months of study, Galen leaves for Rome, but carries with him knowledge that originated in Alexandria's library and museum. He then writes voluminously on medicine works that themselves would eventually find a place on the library shelves, if only for a short time. Despite these bright spots, a slow decline is at work. The Romans, practical as they were, did not invest in the library with quite the same passion as the Ptolemies. The emperors valued Alexandria's grain and trade above its books. Funding for the museum likely continued under the early emperors, but possibly at a reduced level. The library, no longer the only jewel in a king's crown, perhaps saw fewer new acquisitions. Over time, some scholars likely left for opportunities in Rome or Athens or other centers. The intellectual community became more diverse in focus too. By the late 2nd and early 3rd century, Christianity had gained a strong foothold in Alexandria, and with it came a new kind of scholarship. Christian theologians like Clement of Alexandria and Origen established a catechetical school in the city, where they studied scriptures but also engaged with Greek philosophy to explain their faith. Initially, this Christian school coexisted with the older pagan institutions indeed. Clement and Origen quoted freely from classical literature and likely had some access to the books of the library to support their work. But it signaled a shifting intellectual climate, one where the spiritual and theological increasingly vied with the secular and traditional. The Roman world itself was undergoing turmoil by the 3rd century CE. A period known as the crisis of the 3rd century, around 235–284 CE, brought invasions, economic troubles, and rapid turnover of emperors. Alexandria, too, was swept into these upheavals. There were riots, uprisings, and harsh repressions. Periodically, calamities struck the city. For instance, in 215 CE, Emperor Caracalla visited Alexandria, and, angered by satirical comments the Alexandrians made about him, retaliated by massacring a large group of the city's youth in the gymnasium. We can only imagine the horror and how the scholarly community must have gone deathly quiet in the aftermath, shaken that even their cosmopolitan city could suffer such brutality. Events like that massacre likely cast a pall over intellectual life, at least for a time. One notable episode affecting the library's legacy occurred in the 260s CE. By this time, the Roman Empire was fractured. A breakaway regime, the Palmyrene Empire, under Queen Zenobia, had taken control of the East, including Egypt. Zenobia's generals seized Alexandria around 269 CE. A few years later, in 272 CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought to recapture the city for the Central Empire. The battles were fierce and destructive. In the course of Aurelian's assault, the Bruchaion, the royal quarter, where the palace and presumably the main library were located, was devastated. Contemporary sources mention that much of that quarter was laid waste by fire and sword. Whatever of the library's collection had survived into the mid-3rd century might have perished in these flames if it had not already been moved. Let us pause to envision what this might have looked like, though we do so from a distance to preserve our calm mood. It's the middle of the 3rd century, and after days of street fighting, Aurelian's forces have breached the royal quarter. Night falls with an ominous glow over the city once again. We see, perhaps, the outline of the great museum building, now with flames licking from its windows. The once quiet portico where scholars recited poetry is filled with the crash of collapsing roofs and the acrid smell of smoke. We do not hear the shouts or screams. Our perspective is like watching from a hill in the cool night, witnessing a tragic scene in silence. When dawn breaks, a heavy pall of smoke hangs over the bruised city. If any brave librarians had stayed during the battle, they now step through rubble where lectures used to be held. A column lies toppled across the courtyard. Scattered on the ground are bits of charred papyrus and wood. Perhaps a statue of a muse that once inspired visitors is found cracked in half amid the ashes. It's as if a temple has been desecrated. Aurelian is victorious, and Alexandria is brought back under Roman control, but the damage is done. It is widely believed by historians that this was the fatal blow to the Great Library's main collection, if it hadn't already been dissipated by neglect. After Aurelian's war, the royal quarter was no longer intact. If the original library building was still standing before, it likely was destroyed at this time. However, knowledge in Alexandria was not entirely snuffed out. We remember that daughter library at the Serapeum outside the Bruchaion. Evidence suggests that the Serapeum's library and the teaching of scholars affiliated with it or with the museum continued even after Aurelian's destruction. The museum as an official institution might have effectively ended. Some say membership in the museum ceased after the 260s. But the intellectual life shifted perhaps to the Serapeum or to private circles. In the late 3rd century, Alexandria saw another wave of turmoil. A local revolt against Rome around 297 CE led the Emperor Diocletian to besiege the city. After a long blockade, Diocletian captured Alexandria and, by some accounts, exacted a brutal revenge, slaying many inhabitants. Later legend claims he remarked that Alexandria, which prided itself on its wit, had no one left to laugh at his pun due to the massacre. With regard to knowledge, Diocletian also issued a peculiar decree. He ordered the burning of certain books on alchemy. Alexandria had a reputation as a center for alchemical studies. Alchemy in those days was an esoteric mix of chemistry, metallurgy, and magic, often focused on trying to transmute base metals into precious ones like gold. Diocletian feared that Egyptian alchemists could actually succeed in making gold and silver, thus potentially funding rebellions against him. To eliminate that threat, he commanded that all texts on alchemical secrets be destroyed, and so we imagine imperial soldiers rounding up any scrolls on alchemy they could find, perhaps searching workshops or private collections, or even the Serapeum's holdings, then casting them onto bonfires. By Diocletian's time, the Great Library's main collection was probably gone, but this act shows how intellectual pursuits were increasingly viewed with suspicion by authorities if they seemed subversive or dangerous. By the dawn of the 4th century, the early 300 CE, the Library of Alexandria, as a grand institution, had faded. If one visited Alexandria in, say, 320 CE, one would still find a vibrant city, but not the concentrated community of scholars of old. The Serapeum likely still housed some scrolls and perhaps a circle of Neoplatonist philosophers who met under its portico. Indeed, a historian named Ammianus Marcellinus, who visited Alexandria in the 4th century before 391, noted that he saw the Serapeum and that it had once housed a library, implying that by his visit the library was no longer there. Perhaps the shelves were empty or repurposed. Still, knowledge was kept alive by individuals. The mathematician Theon, the father of Hypatia, was active in Alexandria in the late 4th century, teaching and writing. He is sometimes called the last member of the museum, perhaps an honorary title by that point. Theon edited and commented on classical works, including Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest. This tells us that he at least had copies of those works in Alexandria circa 380 CE, likely drawn from what remained of library resources or from copies made earlier. The Roman Empire itself was changing profoundly. Christianity had become the state religion by the end of the 4th century. The old pagan temples and their scholars were increasingly viewed with hostility or at least skepticism by the Christian authorities. In Alexandria, tensions among the pagan minority, the Christian majority, and the still sizable Jewish community grew intense. The stage is set for the final chapters of the library story, which are intertwined with religious conflict and the twilight of the classical world. Before we move to that final act, let's gather the picture calmly in our minds. It is the year 370 CE in Alexandria. The Great Library in the Palace Quarter is no more destroyed a century earlier. But across town at the Serapeum, a few aging scholars still gather in the afternoons to discuss philosophy. They read copies of Plato and Aristotle, though these may be copies they themselves or their forebears rescued decades earlier from troubled times. The Serapeum's once grand library, the daughter of the Great Library, is a shadow of itself. Perhaps some shelves stand empty or hold just a few dozen scrolls of classical literature that the scholars and temple priests managed to protect. The Serapeum itself is now not just a library and temple, but something of a last refuge for the old intellectual life of a pagan world. Outside, the city's mood is shifting. Monks and Christian clerics preach in the streets, denouncing the idols of the pagans. Many scholars have converted to Christianity and turned their studies to the Bible and church doctrine. Others have left for places like Athens, one of the last pagan havens. Those who remain in Alexandria and still cling to the old learning do so carefully, perhaps timidly, aware that they are custodians of a fragile flame that the changing winds could easily extinguish. Temples. Torn down. The Serapeum and Hypatia. We have now reached the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, a time when the ancient world is undergoing a profound transformation. Christianity is not only legal now, but has become the official religion of the Roman Empire. The old pagan temples are increasingly seen by authorities and zealous converts as vestiges of superstition obstacles to the new faith's complete dominance. In Alexandria, this cultural shift sets the stage for the final blows to the legacy of the Great Library. In the year 391 CE, a defining event occurs, the destruction of the Serapeum. The Serapeum, you'll recall, was the magnificent temple of Serapis that also housed the daughter library of Alexandria. By this time, it was one of the last strongholds for those devoted to the old ways, both religiously, for pagan worshippers, and intellectually, for Neoplatonist philosophers and keepers of the remaining classical scrolls. Let us paint the picture softly but clearly. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I has issued edicts declaring that pagan worship must cease, temples should be closed, idols destroyed. In Alexandria, Theophilus, the archbishop, patriarch of the city, is fervent in carrying out these orders. Tensions between the pagans and the increasingly powerful Christians have been simmering and now boil over. One day, a group of enraged pagans, feeling cornered and desperate, take refuge inside the Serapeum. Among them are likely devotees of the old gods, the priests of Serapis, and perhaps some philosophers who see this as a stand, not just for their religion, but for their cultural identity. They fortify themselves in the temple, even reportedly capturing some Christians who intrude and torturing them, nailing one to a cross atop the temple walls in a grim parody of the Christian symbol. It is a brief and futile rebellion born of anger and fear. The imperial authority cannot tolerate this defiance. Emperor Theodosius sends word that the pagans who surrender will be pardoned. For the empire does not want to make martyrs of them, but the Serapeum must be demolished as punishment and as a final stamp of Christian victory. The pagans, realizing their plight, slip away or surrender under promise of clemency. And then Alexandria's Christian population, led zealously by Archbishop Theophilus, descends upon the Serapeum. Picture the scene of the Serapeum's end in a detached, almost dreamlike way. The temple complex stands on a hill on Alexandria's southwest, its great columns and courtyards that once impressed all visitors now filled with a surging crowd. Many carry tools, hammers, iron bars, ropes. They are not a random mob exactly. They act with an air of divine sanction, chanting hymns or crying out scriptural verses as they work. First, they target the idol of Serapis himself, a colossal statue that has stood within the Serapeum's main hall, the very embodiment of the god. Ropes are thrown around its stone neck and limbs. With dozens pulling in unison, the statue is toppled from its pedestal. It crashes to the marble floor and shatters the echo of its fall, rolling across the courtyards. A shout goes up, a mix of triumph and fury. The pieces of Serapis' head, torso, limbs are hauled out of the temple. Later accounts describe how the Christians dragged the broken idol through the streets and burned what remained in a bonfire, mocking the once revered image. Inside the Serapeum, the sanctuaries are desecrated. Altars are overturned, golden ceremonial objects seized. Whatever iconography of the old religion is found, carvings, scrolls of pagan liturgies. Ceremonial vestments is destroyed or made a spectacle of. Fires are kindled in many places within the temple, feeding on wooden beams and furniture, and perhaps on books if any are at hand. Which brings us to the question of the Serapeum's library. What happened to those remaining scrolls? Here is one of history's intriguing silences. We have 5 independent accounts detailing the Serapeum's destruction by church historians like Rufinus and Socrates Scholasticus, by pagan sympathizers like Eunapius, and others, yet none explicitly mention the fate of a library or books. They focus on the religious treasures and the idol. This omission suggests that by 391 CE, the Serapeum's library may have already been depleted. Ammianus, as we noted, said the Serapeum had once a library. Perhaps in the years leading up, some philosophers quietly removed precious scrolls for safekeeping, sensing the looming threat. It's possible a portion of the collection was hidden or transferred, where, we do not know, maybe to private homes of scholars or out of Egypt entirely. Or it could be that the library was simply neglected over time scrolls decaying or taken as spoils by officials, and by 391 there was little of it left to burn. Still, we cannot rule out that some books perished that day. One later account by the historian Orosius, writing about a decade after 391, implies that by his time nothing was left. He remarks that at the Serapeum now one can see empty shelves which once held books. The appearance of the empty shelves, he says, still evokes regret. That sentence paints a mournful image. After the Serapeum's destruction, someone peering into its ruined library room, seeing rows of niches or cabinets now barren, gathering dust. If any scrolls had survived the onslaught, they likely would have been seized as pagan literature and either destroyed or dispersed. So, in our narrative, the Serapeum's fall represents the final physical destruction associated with Alexandria's libraries. Let us absorb it in a reflective manner. The year is 391. The greatest temple of Alexandria's traditional religion lies in ruins. The library that was its intellectual heart, perhaps long diminished, has been effectively snuffed out. Some later writers romantically describe that moment, how the valuable Library of Alexandria was pillaged or destroyed. And 20 years later, the empty shelves excited the regret of every spectator whose mind was not darkened by religious prejudice. These are words penned much later by Edward Gibbon, but based on ancient hints. To the enlightened pagan or even moderate Christian onlooker, it must have felt as if a link to a gentler, wiser past was being severed. Yet even now, the story of Alexandria's intellectual life is not quite over. In the aftermath of the Serapeum's destruction, one figure stands out as a beacon of the old learning shining in a new world. Hypatia. Hypatia of Alexandria, born around 350-370 CE, was the daughter of Theon, the mathematician we mentioned earlier. From her father, she learned mathematics and astronomy, and she quickly outshone him. Hypatia became renowned as a philosopher, one of the last great Neoplatonists. She was also a teacher of mathematics and astronomy. Her pupils came from various backgrounds. Pagans and Christians alike sought her instruction, which is a testament to her personal charisma and intellectual reputation in a now mostly Christian city. In the 400s CE, Hypatia stands out as an extraordinary woman. Imagine her presence, often described as wearing the philosopher's robe, moving with grace through the city streets, and commanding respect in an overwhelmingly male and increasingly Christian arena. She gave public lectures on philosophy, perhaps in some remaining lecture hall of the old museum, or maybe in an open forum near the Caesarean, a former temple. Crowds gathered to hear Hypatia's eloquent discourses on Plato or Aristotle. She had a way of making complex ideas clear and inspired devotion among her students. Hypatia inherited from her father the role of preserving classical knowledge. She edited or commented on works like Diophantus's Arithmetic and Apollonius' Conics, advanced mathematical texts, and some say she contributed to Ptolemy's Almagest. Letters from one of her students, Synesius of Cyrene, who later became a Christian bishop, give us heartwarming glimpses of Hypatia's teaching. Synesius writes to her requesting scientific devices like an astrolabe for astronomy and seeking her guidance on solving philosophical problems. We see, through his eyes, Hypatia engaging in hands-on science. She apparently taught how to construct an astrolabe, a device for mapping the heavens. We also see her warm mentorship. Synesius addresses her with deep affection and respect. To set a serene scene, let's imagine an afternoon in the year 410 CE. In a modest lecture room in Alexandria, Hypatia is conducting a class. The sunlight filters through a high window, dust motes dancing in the beam. Hypatia stands by a large sand table. With a stylus, she sketches geometric figures as she explains a theorem. Her students, seated on benches or the floor, listen intently. Perhaps one of them is a young man destined to be a philosopher. Another might be a curious Christian deacon eager for secular learning. All are welcome, as Hypatia is known for her open door and open mind. After mathematics, the conversation drifts to Plato's concept of the divine. Hypatia speaks with a calm passion, quoting from memory lines of Plotinus or Plato, connecting them to ethical questions of the day. Some students furrow their brows, others nod in enlightenment. She fosters not just rote learning, but true understanding, encouraging them to question and reason. By evening, the class disperses with gratitude. Hypatia walks home through the quiet streets. She never married. The sources say she likely kept a life of chastity and independence in the spirit of a dedicated philosopher. We can imagine her passing by the shell of the Serapeum's ruins on the hill, perhaps casting a sad glance at the place where she might have studied as a youth before it was destroyed. But she does not despair. She carries the light of that heritage within her, continuing to teach the old wisdom to new generations. However, Hypatia's prominence and her association with the old pagan intelligentsia made her a target in an increasingly fanatical climate. Alexandria, around 412 CE, got a new archbishop, Cyril of Alexandria, the nephew of Theophilus. Cyril was ardent and aggressive in asserting Christian dominance. Under his leadership, hostilities flared, especially between the church and the civil authority. The Roman prefect, governor of Alexandria at that time, was Orestes, a moderate man and a Christian, but he maintained close friendships with non-Christians in the city's elite, among them Hypatia. In fact, Hypatia had become something of an advisor to Orestes, given her wisdom and perhaps neutral stance in civic matters. Cyril and Orestes clashed over many issues, including Cyril's harsh treatment of Alexandria's large Jewish community. Hypatia, unfortunately, got embroiled in this feud in the public imagination. She was accused by Cyril's supporters of preventing Orestes from reconciling with the bishop, insinuating that her pagan philosophy was poisoning the prefect's mind against the true faith. Whisper campaigns in the streets charged her with sorcery and ungodly influence. Then, in March 415 CE, tragedy struck. In the season of Lent, when emotions were high and crowds gathered often for worship or processions, a mob led by a fanatical Christian reader named Peter lay in wait for Hypatia. One day, as Hypatia rode through the city in her chariot or carriage, this mob accosted her. We shift to a hush in our narrative now, observing from afar what followed with sorrowful detachment. They forcefully drag Hypatia from her carriage and into a church, ironically, one called Caesareum, which had once been a temple and was now Cyril's cathedral. Here, in the sacred space, fury and fear overtake reason. The mob strips her of her garments, and using broken pieces of pottery or rough oyster shells, they beat and cut her. They brutally kill her. Contemporary accounts say she was flayed and torn apart. We will not dwell on the gore, suffice it that her end was violently horrific. After murdering her, the mob hacks her body into pieces and carries the mangled remains outside the city walls to burn them, as if to utterly obliterate this symbol of pagan learning. And then silence. Hypatia is gone. The flame of classical philosophy in Alexandria is snuffed out in that cruel moment. Even many Christians recoil in horror at what has been done. The prefect Orestes, we can imagine, is heartbroken and likely fearful his trusted friend and counselor has been lynched by supposedly devout men. In time, Orestes leaves Alexandria, and Cyril remains in power, later even canonized. As a saint by the Church, his reputation much debated to this day, with this dark stain often remembered. With Hypatia's death, an era truly ends. Scholars thereafter flee Alexandria for more tolerant climes, or bury themselves in exclusively Christian pursuits. The Neoplatonist school in Athens, which lasted until 529 CE, perhaps takes in some of Hypatia's displaced students. But Alexandria's unique role as a meeting ground of civilizations and ideas is finished. The city continues as a great urban center, one of Christianity's intellectual hubs, in fact, producing theologians and new schools of thought, but the classical library is but a memory. Let us take a gentle moment to mourn Hypatia and what she represented. The image of her demise is harsh, but let us replace it with a kinder one. Visualize instead Hypatia in her prime, in the quiet of her study at dusk, writing a commentary on Euclid. A small oil lamp casts a golden circle of light on her scroll. The sounds of the city are muted. Maybe through her window she hears the distant prayers from a church and the last call of a night bird. She stops her pen for a moment and looks up at the stars that have begun to twinkle. She closes her eyes and breathes deeply, perhaps silently reciting a line from Plato about the eternal nature of the soul or the truth of the cosmos. In that stillness, Hypatia's spirit feels connected to all those great minds preserved in her library scrolls, and despite all the changes around her, she feels continuity. It is that continuity which was severed in 415 CE. After Hypatia's death, we hear of few, if any, notable secular scholars in Alexandria. Some intellectual activity continued in the church context. For instance, a few decades later, a Christian philosopher, John Philoponus, would critique Aristotle and innovate ideas that presaged modern physics, but even he operated within a Christian framework, and after his time, intellectual life in Alexandria waned as subsequent conquerors arrived. Thus, by the early 5th century, we mark the fall of Alexandria's library not as one moment, but as a drawn-out twilight culminating in darkness. In our narrative so far, we have seen multiple deaths of the library: the fire under Julius Caesar, the war under Aurelian, the edict under Theodosius, the murder of Hypatia. Each was a cruel cut. If one listens closely in imagination, one might hear echoes of sorrow through time for what was lost at each juncture. Picture now, in this final scene of the ancient story, Alexandria's harbor at night sometime after 415 CE. The great lighthouse still shines its beam across the waters. Indeed, the Pharos would continue to stand for many centuries more, guiding sailors as reliably as ever. But the metaphorical light of knowledge that Alexandria once radiated is largely extinguished. A traveler arriving by ship might still find a bustling port and marketplace, but no longer the awe-inspiring museum of scholars. If they inquire about learned men, locals might shrug and point them perhaps to the bishop's library, for the church did maintain scriptural and theological texts, but it would not be the same. Perhaps in some private home, maybe an old man, a one-time philosopher who managed to survive by staying quiet, lights an oil lamp and unrolls a cherished papyrus he saved in youth. Perhaps it's a fragment of Euripides or a chapter of Euclid, a precious remnant he cannot openly teach, but cannot bear to throw away. He reads a few lines, the ancient words whispering through his mind and carrying him back to brighter days in the museum's halls. A faint smile and a tear might grace his face in the lamp's glow. When he's done, he carefully rolls the scroll closed, tucks it away in a wooden chest, and blows out the lamp. In the darkness, he murmurs a quiet hope that these words will be remembered, even if only by him, as he drifts into the night's silence. The Library of Alexandria, as it was an institution dedicated to knowledge, lives on now only in memory and in scattered books that have found refuge elsewhere. But its story is not quite finished. We will take one more step forward, leaving ancient times and considering how the echoes of that great library have reached us through later ages and what it means for us today. Epilogue: Echoes of Alexandria. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its story does not end with the final flicker of its lamp. In the centuries after Hypatia's death, Alexandria itself continued under new rulers and new religions. By the early 7th century, the city was part of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. Then, in 641 CE, Alexandria fell to an expanding new power, the armies of Islam under General Amr ibn al-As. The transition to Arab rule was significant, but by this time the Great Library was already a memory. Later legends, first recorded many hundreds of years after the fact, would tell a dramatic tale about the Arab conquest and the library. They say that after capturing Alexandria, the Muslim general Amr was asked what to do with a priceless collection of books supposedly discovered in the city. Amr wrote to the Caliph, Umar in Arabia, for guidance. The Caliph's reply, according to the tale, was chilling in its logic. If these writings of the Greeks agree with the Book of God, the Quran, they are unnecessary gods. Word is sufficient. If they disagree, they are pernicious and ought to be destroyed. Therefore, destroy them. Obediently, so the story goes, Amr ordered the scrolls to be burned as fuel in Alexandria's bathhouses. There were so many books, it was said, that the public baths furnaces blazed for 6 months with their ashes. It's a haunting image, the last remains of the library fueling the baths, knowledge literally turning to steam. However, historians now doubt this story. For one, it appears in sources only much later, centuries after 641, which makes it suspect. Also, by 641, as we've seen, the library as an institution had long been in decline or gone. It's unlikely a vast repository of pagan literature was still intact for the Arabs to find. More likely, if Alexandria still had any significant books, they were in private collections or ecclesiastical libraries. The tale of the caliph's decree, while probably apocryphal, endures because it captures the poetic tragedy people feel about the loss of the library. The notion that such a wealth of books could vanish and that someone could order them to be destroyed. Whether or not the Arab conquest dealt any blow to books in Alexandria, by then the classical library was effectively extinct. Yet, while the physical scrolls of Alexandria may have been lost, the knowledge contained in them was not entirely extinguished. Much of it had seeded itself elsewhere. The classical Greek and Roman texts that survived did so often by way of copies preserved in other places. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, it was the Eastern Roman, Byzantine Empire that safeguarded a trove of ancient literature in Constantinople and other cities. Scribes in Byzantine monasteries continued copying ancient Greek texts, Homer, Plato, Euclid, etc., through the medieval centuries, albeit selectively. Similarly, the rise of the Islamic Golden Age, 8th to 13th centuries, provided a new and fruitful ground for ancient knowledge. In places like Baghdad, the caliphs established institutions, most famously the House of Wisdom, where scholars, many of them fluent in Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, translated Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic. Through Arabic translations, Aristotle, Plato, Galen, Hippocrates, Ptolemy, and Euclid found new audiences. These works were studied, commented on, and advanced by brilliant minds like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and Averroes. Thus, ideas that might have once sat on the shelves in Alexandria were being taught and debated in Damascus, Cairo, Cordoba, and Baghdad. When Europe went through its early medieval period, much direct knowledge of Greek texts was lost there, but some Latin summaries or commentaries remained, often preserved in monastic libraries. By the High Middle Ages, 12th century onward, there was a push in Europe to recover ancient learning. Scholars in places like Spain and Sicily, where Islamic and Christian worlds met, worked to translate Arabic versions of Greek works into Latin. They effectively carried the torch passed on by Alexandria to the Islamic world, now on to Europe. The elements of Euclid, the Almagest of Ptolemy, the works of Aristotle, these came back to Christian Europe largely through these Arabic-Latin translations in the 12th and 13th centuries. Then came the Renaissance, when Byzantine scholars, fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453, brought precious Greek manuscripts to the West, and European scholars like Poggio Bracciolini scoured monastic libraries for long-neglected Latin texts. The humanists of the Renaissance often invoked the idea of rebuilding or surpassing the knowledge of the ancients. The shadow of the Library of Alexandria's loss haunted them. They knew many ancient works were missing. They found references to them in other works, but could not locate them, and lamented that so much had perished, whether in the flames of war, the rot of time, or the alleged bonfires of zealots. In a sense, the world has been trying to recreate the ideal of Alexandria's library ever since. Every time a great library is founded or an encyclopedia compiled, there's an echo of that dream of a universal library. Today, on the shore of Alexandria, not far from where the ancient library once stood, there is once again a great library, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, inaugurated in 2002. This modern library, with its striking sun-disk design and walls carved with scripts from all over the world, was built as a commemoration and revival of the spirit of the original. It houses millions of books in multiple languages, collections of antiquities, a planetarium, and serves as a cultural center for education and dialogue. It stands symbolically as a beacon of knowledge in the very city that epitomized that concept 2,300 years ago. In our quiet contemplation, what does the story of the Library of Alexandria mean? It is at once inspiring and cautionary. It shows the heights we can achieve when we value knowledge and devote resources to it selflessly. And it shows the depths of loss we suffer when we allow that value to be eroded, whether through neglect, intolerance, or violence. The library's fall was not a single event, but a slow erosion, piece by piece, volume by volume, as the world around it changed. That teaches us something profound, that preserving knowledge is an active, ongoing effort. It's not enough to gather books. One must also guard the conditions that allow learning to thrive: peace, openness, curiosity, tolerance. And yet there is also a hopeful message. The knowledge itself, like energy, never truly disappears. It only changes forms or moves locations. Fragments survive. Ideas find new homes. The torch of Hermes, symbol of knowledge and communication, was carried from one civilization to another. In a way, the Library of Alexandria has never completely died. It's alive in the DNA of our culture. Whenever you read a great book of history, philosophy, or science, you are, unknowingly, leafing through intellectual strands that were once cataloged in Alexandria. The works of Euclid or Archimedes, taught in modern classrooms, come down through an unbroken chain, with a few detours, from those scholars' copies in the Great Library. The plays of Sophocles performed in modern theaters exist because a line of preservation leads back to an ancient book that perhaps sat on Callimachus' shelf. The story is also a reminder of human frailty. We see in it how human conflicts, whether Julius Caesar's ambition or religious zealotry in later ages, can inadvertently or intentionally destroy our collective treasures. It urges a gentle reflection on how we handle knowledge and heritage today. We might ask, what are the libraries of Alexandria of our time? Perhaps not physical libraries only, though those too, but repositories of knowledge, such as digital archives, scientific data, cultural heritage sites. Are we guarding them wisely? Are we funding them generously? Are we protecting them from the metaphorical fires of short-sighted policy or strife? As we come to a close, let's take comfort and solace in the enduring aspects of this tale. We can imagine that somewhere, in some form, the spirit of the library still flickers. Maybe it's late at night in a university library where a lone student surrounded by stacks of books is discovering something that excites the mind. The quiet rustling of pages, the soft pool of light on a desk, the infinite potential contained in the books around that feeling is universal and timeless. It connects us to those scholars of old. In that sense, whenever we seek knowledge with passion and humility, we keep Alexandria's flame alive. It's time now to drift into a peaceful rest, carrying with us the lessons and images from this long journey. Imagine once more the gentle lapping of the Mediterranean Sea against Alexandria's docks. The sun has set, the stars are out in their eternal array. In the distance, the great Pharos lighthouse beams its steady light, one beacon still shining, even as the other, the library, has long been extinguished. The city sleeps, and in some quiet corner, maybe a scholar in late antiquity is gazing at those same stars, pondering the workings of the cosmos, his mind at once filled with ancient knowledge and new questions. Let the waves of time wash over you now. The story of the Library of Alexandria, with all its glory and tragedy, has been gently told and heard. The knowledge seekers of that age have passed their torch. Onward, and it still glows in us. In this knowledge, there is reassurance. Civilization remembers. Learning continues. Now, allow yourself to let go of the narrative and ease into sleep. Perhaps you'll find yourself dreaming of sunlit, scroll-filled halls or starry Alexandrian skies. Perhaps you'll simply drift into a warm, dark quietude, your mind at rest, assured that the pursuit of truth and wisdom is an unbroken chain linking humanity across millennia. Good night and sweet dreams. May you sleep as soundly as the library once stood, and awaken with a mind refreshed, ready to seek out new wisdom with the coming dawn.